Radio crackled with static, then silence. Major Kovac stared at the empty runway through rain-streaked glass, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. 3 minutes ago, Warthog 27 had reported catastrophic structural failure at 11,000 feet. The pilot, some reservist they'd pulled from a desk job in Nevada, had calmly stated her intention to bring the aircraft home. Kovac had seen the radar signature split in two. He'd watched one piece tumble toward the mountains while the other kept flying. Now he stood in the tower with his hands pressed flat against the console, waiting for a ghost. The storm hammered Wright-Patterson Air Force Base like artillery fire. Lightning turned the clouds purple, and the wind bent the flagpole nearly horizontal. Someone in the tower said a prayer. Someone else called for the crash crews to stand ready. Kovac said nothing. He'd been flying combat missions when this pilot was still in elementary school, and he knew metal fatigue when he saw it. Knew what happened when a 30-year-old airframe met high-G maneuvers over hostile territory. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was a tank with wings, built to absorb punishment that would shred any other aircraft. But everyone had limits. Even legends died. The scope showed nothing. The last transmission had come from 18 miles out, the pilot's voice steady despite the shrieking wind noise in the background. Tower, Warthog 27. Right wing separation confirmed. Hydraulics at 30%. I have visual on your lights. Kovac had asked for her fuel state. She'd responded with numbers that made his stomach drop. She was flying on vapor and willpower, dragging 30,000 pounds of crippled titanium through a thunderstorm on a wing and a prayer, except she was missing the wing. The story should have ended there. Should have been another name on the memorial wall, another folded flag, another closed casket funeral with a flyover missing one bird from the formation. But 20 seconds ago, the emergency frequency had crackled to life. One word, one call sign. Valkyrie. Kovac grabbed the binoculars. Through the sheets of rain, through the darkness that swallowed everything beyond the runway lights, he caught it. A single red anti-collision beacon, bobbing and weaving like a drunk firefly. Too low, coming in too fast. The shape behind it was wrong, asymmetrical, impossible. The A-10 emerged from the storm like something born from wreckage, its left wing intact, but its right side terminating in a ragged stump of metal, where 3,000 pounds of aluminum and ordnance had simply ceased to exist. The aircraft was cocked at an obscene angle, fighting physics with every foot of altitude. The landing gear was down. The pilot was coming in hot. Kovac keyed his mic. His voice came out calmer than he felt. Valkyrie, you are cleared for emergency landing. Runway 18. Wind 270 at 35, gusting to 50. Crash crews are standing by. He paused, then added something he'd never said in 30 years of service. Bring it home, Lieutenant, just bring it home. The A-10 dropped like a wounded hawk. The approach was a nightmare, the aircraft wallowing in the crosswind, the asymmetric lift trying to flip it inverted with every gust. Kovac could see the ailerons fighting, the rudder kicked hard over, the nose yawing left and right as the pilot fought to keep the aircraft aligned. The landing gear touched first on the left side, the tire smoking instantly from the side loading. Then the right gear, what was left of the right side, scraped down. Sparks fountained 30 feet high. Metal screamed. The aircraft slewed sideways, carving a diagonal line across the runway, shedding debris in a glittering trail. Fire bloomed from the right side where hydraulic fluid met friction. The foam trucks roared forward. The A-10 spun once, twice, then shuddered to a stop 300 feet from the end of the runway, sitting in a cloud of steam and chemical foam. The canopy blew. A figure climbed out, dropped to the tarmac, and stumbled forward 3 steps before collapsing to her knees. The crash crews swarmed her. Kovac was already running, his dress shoes slipping on the wet stairs as he bolted from the tower. By the time he reached the runway, they had Lieutenant Imani Kadir sitting upright, oxygen mask over her face, medics checking her pupils. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat and hydraulic fluid. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't undo her harness, but her eyes were clear, focused, alive. Kovac knelt beside her, "What the hell happened up there, Lieutenant?" Kadir pulled the mask aside. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible over the wind. "Sam's site, Syria. They didn't tell me the coordinates were outdated." She coughed, spat blood. "Missile took the wing clean off at the root. Thought I was dead." "You should be." "Yes, sir." She looked back at the wreckage of her aircraft still smoking on the runway. The A-10 sat there like a defiant tombstone, the nose art visible even through the foam, a winged woman in armor, sword raised. Valkyrie. But she wouldn't let me quit. Kavek followed her gaze. He'd flown A-10s in the Gulf War, had nursed crippled birds home through sandstorms and ground fire, but he'd never seen anything like this. The aircraft was destroyed. By every rule of aerodynamics and structural engineering, it should have tumbled from the sky the moment the wings separated. The fact that it hadn't, that Kadir had somehow kept it flying for 18 minutes and brought it down without killing herself, defied explanation. He wanted to call it luck. But luck didn't carve that kind of precision into a crash landing. Luck didn't walk away. The base commander arrived, a full colonel with too much brass and not enough flight hours. He took one look at the wreckage and turned to Kavak. "Is she injured?" "Bruised ribs, possible concussion, nothing critical." "Good. I want a full investigation. That aircraft was barely flight-worthy to begin with. Someone signed off on a mission with a structurally compromised airframe." Kadir tried to stand. The medics pushed her back down. "Sir, the aircraft was sound. The maintenance logs." "I'll review the logs, Lieutenant. Right now, you need medical attention." The colonel's tone left no room for argument. He turned back to Kavak. "Get her to the hospital. I want preliminary reports by 0600. Kavak watched him walk away, already talking into his radio, already building the narrative that would bury this under bureaucracy and blame. He'd seen it before. Anytime something impossible happened, the system found ways to make it ordinary, found ways to explain away the unexplainable. But there was no explaining this. No report could capture what Kadir had done. The weeks that followed were a slow-motion avalanche of paperwork and politics. Kadir was grounded pending investigation. The wreckage of Warthog 27 was hauled to a hangar and picked apart by engineers who spoke in hushed voices about stress fractures and metal fatigue. The preliminary reports were damning. The wing spar had been compromised for months, microscopic cracks spreading through the aluminum like cancer. It should have been caught during inspection. Someone had missed it or ignored it, and Kadir had paid the price at 11,000 feet over hostile territory. But the engineers couldn't explain how she'd flown it home. The computer models said it was impossible. The moment the wings separated, the A-10 should have entered an unrecoverable spin. The asymmetric lift, the loss of control authority, the shift in center of gravity, any one of those factors should have been fatal. All three together were a death sentence. Yet Kadir had fought the aircraft for 18 minutes, adjusted for every shift in weight and drag, and brought it down on a runway in the worst storm of the year. The lead engineer, a civilian with 4 decades of experience, told Kavak it was the most impressive piece of flying he'd ever seen. Then he'd added quietly that it was also the luckiest. Kavak didn't believe in luck, not that kind. He'd arranged to see Kadir's service record, the full file, not just the sanitized version in her personnel jacket. What he found surprised him. Imani Kadir had enlisted at 18, fresh out of a nothing town in Montana where the biggest employer was a copper mine. She'd scored high enough on the ASVAB to go anywhere, do anything, but she'd chosen aircraft maintenance. Spent 6 years turning wrenches on C-130s in Germany before applying for officer candidate school. She'd been turned down twice. Too old, they said. Too inexperienced. She'd applied a 3rd time and been accepted, then fought her way through pilot training with scores that were good but not exceptional. She'd graduated in the middle of her class, been assigned to A-10s because nobody wanted them anymore, and spent the next 4 years flying support missions that never made the news. There was nothing in her record that suggested she was special. No commendations for valor, no distinguished service medals, just a steady accumulation of flight hours and competence. The kind of pilot who showed up, did her job, and went home, unremarkable, invisible. The kind of officer who would spend 20 years in uniform and retire as a major, forgotten by everyone except the people she'd served with. But there was one note in her file that caught Kavek's attention, a psychological evaluation from her first year as a pilot. The evaluator had noted that Kadir displayed an unusual level of focus under stress, a tendency to narrow her attention to the immediate problem and exclude everything else. It wasn't pathological, the evaluator wrote, but it was notable. In another context, it might have been called tunnel vision. In a cockpit, it was survival. Kavek closed the file. He'd flown with dozens of pilots who had better instincts, faster reflexes, sharper tactical minds. But none of them would have brought that A-10 home. They would have ejected, followed procedure, trusted the parachute and the rescue team. Kadir hadn't. She'd stayed with her aircraft, fought it through the impossible, and refused to let physics win. That wasn't training. That was something else. Something the Air Force didn't have a manual for. The investigation dragged on. Kadir remained grounded, stuck behind a desk at Wright-Patterson, filing reports and answering the same questions from different colonels and generals who wanted to understand how she'd done what she'd done. She gave them the technical answers, throttle adjustments, rudder inputs, weight distribution calculations. But Kavek could see she was holding something back, something she couldn't put into words or wouldn't. The look in her eyes when she talked about the flight was distant, like she was seeing something beyond the hangar walls. He found her one evening in the hangar where they'd stored what was left of Warthog 27. She was standing in front of the wreckage, still in her dress blues, her service cap tucked under her arm. The A-10 looked even worse under the fluorescent lights, the missing wing like an amputated limb. But the fuselage was intact. The cockpit was intact. The nose art, Valkyrie sword raised, was scorched but still visible. "You shouldn't be here, Lieutenant," Kavek said. Kadir didn't turn. "I keep thinking I missed something, some detail that would explain it. The engineers say it's impossible." "I know what they say." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. "I felt it, sir, when the wing came off. The whole aircraft shifted like someone had cut the strings. I should have lost it right there. But I didn't, I just held on." "Held on to what?" She shook her head. "I don't know, the stick, the throttle, my sanity, all of it." She laughed, a brittle sound. "They're going to ground me, aren't they, permanently, say I'm too much of a risk." Kavek was silent. She was probably right. The investigation would conclude that she'd gotten lucky, that the structural failure wasn't her fault, but that her decision to fly the crippled aircraft instead of ejecting showed poor judgment. They'd reassign her to a training squadron or a desk job, somewhere she couldn't hurt herself or cost the Air Force another multi-million-dollar aircraft. She'd fly a few more years, maybe, then quietly retire. The story would fade. The miracle landing would become a footnote in some safety report. But that wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was the waste of it. Kadir had done something that shouldn't have been possible, had demonstrated a level of skill and determination that came along once in a generation, and the system was going to punish her for it. Because the system didn't know what to do with people who broke the rules of physics, didn't know how to categorize them, reward them, or even acknowledge them. So it ground them down until they fit. "Tell me about the call sign," Kavek said. "Valkyrie, that's not standard issue." Kadir's expression softened. "It was a joke at first, my first squadron. I was the only woman. They called me Valkyrie because I was always hauling the dead weight, ferrying broken aircraft back from forward bases, cleaning up other people's messes. I hated it." She paused. "Then I looked up what it meant. The choosers of the slain, the ones who decide who lives and who dies, and I thought, yeah, that's about right." Kavek understood then. The call sign wasn't a joke. It was a promise, a declaration. Kadir had decided somewhere along the way that she wasn't going to let anyone die on her watch. Not her wingmen, not her aircraft, not herself. It was an impossible standard, the kind that broke people, but she'd held to it. Even when the wing came off and the laws of physics said she was finished, she'd held to it. They're not going to ground you, Kovac said. Sir, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and I'm putting you forward for a position with the weapons school, instructor pilot. You're going to teach other pilots how to do what you did. Kadir stared at him. I can't teach what I did. I don't even know what I did. Then you'll teach them how to hold on when everything says to let go. Kovac met her eyes. The Air Force needs pilots who don't quit, who don't follow the textbook when the textbook says to die. We need more Valkyries. The recommendation went through, against all expectations. The investigation concluded that Kadir had acted with exceptional skill and courage, and that her decision to remain with the aircraft had been justified by the outcome. The Distinguished Flying Cross was awarded in a quiet ceremony. No press, just a handful of officers and the base commander who'd wanted to bury the story. Kadir stood at attention while a general she'd never met pinned the medal to her chest and said words about duty and sacrifice that felt rehearsed. But when it was over, when the general had left and the other officers had drifted away, Kovac pulled her aside. How does it feel? He asked. Kadir looked down at the medal, heavier than I expected. They always are. She was transferred to Nelly's Air Force Base 3 weeks later, assigned to the weapons school as an instructor for the A-10 program. It should have been a career ender. Instructor positions were where pilots went a fade into irrelevance. But Kadir didn't fade. She threw herself into the work with the same intensity she'd brought to flying. She taught her students about energy management and threat assessment and how to bring a crippled aircraft home through sheer stubbornness. She didn't talk about the landing at Wright-Patterson unless they asked, but they always asked, and when they did, she told them the truth. I was terrified, she'd say, the whole time, from the moment the wing came off until the wheels touched down, but I didn't let the fear make decisions. I stayed in the moment, one input at a time, 1 second at a time. That's all you can do. The students would nod, scribbling notes. They thought they understood, but they didn't, not really. Understanding came later when they found themselves in the crucible, when the aircraft was screaming and the ground was coming up fast and every instinct said to eject. That's when they'd remember Valkyrie, remember her standing in front of the class talking about holding on. And some of them, a few, would do what she'd done. They'd stay with it, fight through it, bring it home. The months passed. Kadir's reputation grew quietly the way legends always did in the military. She wasn't famous. The Air Force didn't publicize her story, didn't want other pilots thinking they could fly crippled aircraft home. But the pilots knew, they always knew. They'd see her walking across the ramp at Nelly's and they'd nudge each other, whisper the story. That's Valkyrie. She flew an A-10 home with 1 wing. The story would spread, change, grow in the telling. By some versions, she'd lost both wings. By others, she'd been on fire or blind or shot through the chest. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the symbol, a pilot who didn't quit, who chose to live when dying was easier. Kovac tracked her career from Wright-Patterson. He'd been reassigned to the Pentagon, pushing papers and attending meetings that could have been emails, but he made a point of staying in touch. Every few months, he'd call Nelly's, ask how she was doing. The reports were always the same. Kadir was an excellent instructor, demanding but fair, respected by her students. She flew every training sortie like it was combat. She didn't socialize much, kept to herself, spent her off hours in the gym or the library. Unremarkable, invisible, except for the medal in her service record and the scar on her ribs from where the harness had cut deep during the landing. Then, 16 months after the Wright-Patterson incident, the orders came down. A surge in operations over Syria. The A-10 squadrons were being deployed, and the Air Force needed experienced combat pilots. Kadir was being pulled from the weapons school and sent back to the fight. Kovac heard about it through back channels, called Nelly's, got her on the phone. How do you feel about going back? He asked. There was a long pause. Honestly, sir, relieved. Relieved? Teaching is important, I know that, but it's not flying, not really. Another pause. I need to be in the cockpit. Kovac understood. Some pilots could walk away from the flight line, find satisfaction in training or planning or command, but others couldn't. They needed the G-forces and the adrenaline and the razor's edge between control and chaos. Kadir was one of those. The landing at Wright-Patterson hadn't scared her away from flying. If anything, it had locked her in. She'd survived the impossible, and now everything else felt like practice. "Watch your six out there," Kovac said. "Always do, sir." She deployed 3 weeks later, flying out of Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. The missions were close air support, the same grind Kadir had been doing for years, low-altitude passes over desert towns, coordinating with ground forces, hunting targets that melted into the civilian population the moment the A-10s appeared. It was dangerous work, the kind where one mistake could kill friendlies or flatten a school, but Kadir was good at it. Her call sign was known to the ground controllers now, passed along through the network of forward operating bases. When Valkyrie was on station, the troops on the ground breathed easier. She didn't miss, didn't hesitate, brought the fire exactly where it was needed and nowhere else. But the war had changed since her last deployment. The enemy had better weapons now, better training. Russian-made surface-to-air missiles that could track an aircraft through clouds and smoke. Chinese radar systems that lit up the sky. The old playbook, fly low, fly fast, trust the titanium bathtub to keep you alive, didn't work anymore. Pilots were dying, not in spectacular crashes but in slow increments. A hit to the hydraulics here, an engine fire there. Birds limping home with battle damage that should have been fatal, only to be grounded permanently because the airframes were too old, too worn, too expensive to repair. The A-10 was obsolete, everyone said. A relic from the Cold War, kept flying by bureaucracy and nostalgia. It needed to be retired. Kadir didn't care about the politics. She cared about the soldiers on the ground who called for help when the mortars started falling, who trusted that someone would answer. So she flew, every mission, every sortie. She pushed her aircraft to the limits, threading through valleys to stay below radar, popping up to strike and diving back down before the missiles could lock. She took hits, bullet holes in the wings, shrapnel through the tail. Once, an anti-aircraft round punched clean through her left engine cowling and out the other side without detonating. She brought the aircraft home, watched the maintainers shake their heads in disbelief, and flew again the next day. The other pilots started calling her lucky. Kadir hated it. Luck was for people who didn't prepare, who trusted chance instead of skill. She wasn't lucky, she was careful. But the nickname stuck, layered on top of Valkyrie until she carried both. Lucky Valkyrie, the pilot who couldn't die. Then came the mission that proved them wrong. It was a routine close air support call, or as routine as anything could be in a war zone. A convoy of Marines pinned down by mortar fire near the Iraqi border, taking casualties, requesting immediate air support. Kadir was on station with her wingman, Warthog 3-1, a captain named Reyes who'd been flying A-10 since before Kadir was an instructor. They coordinated with the ground controller, got the target coordinates, began their attack run. Kadir went first, diving from 8,000 feet, the GAU-8 Avenger cannon spooling up with its distinctive roar. She lit up the enemy position with 30mm rounds, saw the explosions ripple across the hillside, pulled up hard to clear the ridge. That's when the missile hit. She didn't see it launch, didn't hear the warning tone. 1 second she was climbing, the next her aircraft was tumbling, spinning, the world outside the canopy a blur of sky and sand and fire. Alarm screamed in her helmet. The stick was dead in her hands. She pulled the ejection handle, felt the canopy blow, the rocket motor ignite beneath her seat. The acceleration slammed her into unconsciousness. She came to dangling from a parachute, the desert spinning below, smoke rising from the wreckage of her A-10 a half-mile away. She could see figures running toward the crash site. Knew they weren't friendlies. Kadir hit the ground hard, rolled, came up tangled in parachute lines. She fought free, grabbed the survival radio from her vest, keyed the mic. "Valkyrie is down, Valkyrie is down. Enemy forces approaching, require immediate extraction." Her voice was calm, professional, like she was ordering coffee, but her hands were shaking and her left leg wasn't working right. She looked down, saw blood soaking through her flight suit. Shrapnel, probably. She couldn't feel it yet. Shock was a mercy. Reyes came over the radio, his voice tight. "Copy, Valkyrie. I see your position. Stay put. SAR is inbound." But search and rescue was 20 minutes out. The enemy fighters were 2 minutes out. Kadir could see them now, a dozen men with rifles moving fast across the open ground. She pulled her sidearm, a 9mm that felt like a toy compared to what they were carrying. Math said she was dead. Tactics said she was dead. Experience said she was dead. But Kadir had never been good at accepting what she was told. She found cover behind a cluster of rocks, shallow but better than nothing. Checked her ammunition. 15 rounds, not enough. Never enough. The fighters spread out, flanking her position. They knew she was hit, knew she couldn't run. This was just cleanup. She keyed the radio one more time. "Reyes, tell my family I..." The GAU-8 cannon cut her off. The sound was apocalyptic, a chainsaw made of thunder. 30mm rounds chewed the desert into glass. The enemy fighters evaporated, turned to pink mist and torn cloth. Reyes's A-10 roared overhead so low Kadir could see the rivets on the belly, then pulled up vertical and rolled away. The sky was suddenly quiet except for the ringing in her ears. Kadir sat in the dirt, bleeding, staring at the place where the fighters had been. Reyes came back on the radio. "SAR is 2 minutes out, Valkyrie. Stay alive." She tried to respond but couldn't find the words. She was crying, she realized, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face, not from fear, from something else. Relief maybe, or gratitude, or the sudden understanding that she wasn't alone, that someone had her back, that the call sign wasn't just hers, it belonged to every pilot who flew these missions, who risked everything for people they'd never meet. Valkyrie wasn't one person, it was all of them. The helicopter came in low and fast, a Pave Hawk with door guns blazing, scattering the remaining enemy fighters. The pararescue team pulled Kadir aboard, started working on her leg, pumped her full of morphine. She watched Reyes circle overhead, keeping watch, and tried to tell him thank you. But the words wouldn't come. The morphine pulled her under. She woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Germany with a Purple Heart on her chest and orders to return stateside for recovery. The leg healed, took 6 months and 2 surgeries, left her with a limp she'd carry forever. The flight surgeon cleared her for duty with restrictions, no hygiene maneuvers, no combat deployments. Kadir knew what that meant. She was done. Her flying career was over. She'd go back to a desk, push papers, fade into obscurity. The story would end where it should have ended, at Wright-Patterson, with a medal and a miracle and a slow slide into irrelevance. But Kavek had other plans. He'd been promoted to brigadier general by then, assigned to Air Combat Command, overseeing training and doctrine for the entire fighter community. He called Kadir to his office at Langley, sat her down, got straight to the point. "How do you feel about not flying anymore?" Kadir shrugged. "I don't have a choice, sir, medical restrictions." "What if I told you there was another option?" "I'd say you're about to offer me a desk job with a fancy title." Kavek smiled. "Not exactly. I want you to run a program, experimental, teaching advanced survival and recovery techniques to combat pilots. You'd be working with weapons school graduates, teaching them how to handle catastrophic failures, how to make decisions when the book says to quit. We'd call it the Valkyrie Protocol." Kadir blinked. "You want me to train pilots to crash?" "I want you to train pilots to survive." Kavek leaned forward. "What you did at Wright-Patterson, what you've done your entire career, that's not luck, that's not just skill, it's something else. A mindset, a refusal to accept defeat. Most pilots don't have it, but it can be taught, or at least encouraged." He paused. "The Air Force is changing. We're going to be fighting peer adversaries with advanced air defenses. Our pilots need to know how to operate when everything goes wrong. When the aircraft is crippled and the mission is falling apart, and the only option is to do the impossible. You're the best person to teach that." Kadir looked out the window at the flight line. F-22s and F-35s taxiing past, sleek and modern and nothing like the ugly, obsolete A-10 she'd flown. She thought about the pilots climbing into those cockpits, confident in their training and their technology. Thought about what would happen when that confidence met reality, when the missiles started flying and the aircraft started dying. Some of them would panic. Some would follow procedure and eject. And some, a few, would remember a pilot named Valkyrie who'd flown home with one wing and lived to tell about it. "I'll do it," she said. The Valkyrie protocol launched 6 months later at Nellie's. It was a small program, just a handful of students handpicked from the best squadrons in the Air Force. The curriculum was brutal, simulator scenarios designed to break the aircraft and the pilot simultaneously, forcing decisions with no good options. Engine fires during takeoff, hydraulic failures at low altitude, mid-air collisions, structural failures. Every nightmare situation Kadir could imagine, and a few she couldn't. The students hated it, called it the crash course behind her back, but they learned to stay calm when the alarms were screaming, learned to prioritize, adapt, improvise, learned that the worst-case scenario wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. Word spread. Other services wanted in. The Navy sent pilots. The Marines sent pilots. Even the Army sent helicopter crews. The program expanded, moved to a dedicated facility, became a permanent fixture in advanced tactical training. Kadir was promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel. She testified before Congress about the need for resilience training, wrote doctrine that was adopted across the Department of Defense, became the face of a new philosophy in military aviation. But she never forgot where it started. In a storm over Ohio, fighting a crippled aircraft through the impossible, refusing to let go. Years passed. Kadir's hair went gray. The limp got worse. She stopped flying entirely, spent her days in classrooms and offices, shaping policy instead of pulling G-forces. It should have felt like a defeat, but it didn't, because every few months a student would come back from deployment and send her a message. "Use what you taught me. Brought the bird home. Thank you." Or a widow would write, thanking her for training the pilot who'd stayed with a damaged aircraft long enough for the crew to eject. Or a general would mention her name in a speech about courage and determination. The impact was real, measurable, saved lives. Kavek retired before Kadir did, left the Air Force after 40 years of service and moved to Colorado to be near his grandchildren. But he stayed in touch, called her every few months, asked how the program was going, congratulated her on promotions and awards. They never talked about Wright-Patterson directly. Didn't need to. That landing was the foundation everything else was built on, the proof that the impossible was just a matter of perspective. Then came the call Kadir had been dreading. Kavek's wife phoned to say he'd had a heart attack, was in the hospital, wasn't expected to make it. Kadir caught the first flight to Denver, drove straight to the VA medical center, found him in a room with too many machines and not enough hope. He looked small in the bed, diminished, the man who'd commanded squadrons reduced to a body fighting itself. But when he saw her, he smiled. "Hey, Valkyrie," he said, his voice a rasp. "Thanks for coming." Kadir pulled a chair close. "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" "Wouldn't blame you. Long way to come to watch an old man die." "You're not dying, you're just resting." Kavek laughed, winced, still a terrible liar. He reached out, took her hand, his grip was weak. "I need to tell you something about that night at Wright-Patterson." "Sir, you don't have to." He finished. He took a breath, labored. "When I saw you bring that A-10 down, I thought it was the most reckless thing I'd ever seen. Thought you'd gotten lucky, that you'd risked your life for a piece of metal that wasn't worth saving." He paused. "I was wrong. You weren't saving the aircraft. You were proving something, that we don't have to accept defeat, that the rules can be broken if we're willing to pay the cost." His eyes were wet. "You changed how I thought about flying, about leadership, about what's possible. And you've changed hundreds of other pilots too. Maybe thousands. That's a legacy, Imani. That's something real." Kadir couldn't speak. The words were locked in her throat, tangled with grief and gratitude and the weight of everything that had happened since that storm. Kavek squeezed her hand one more time, then let go. "Don't let them forget," he said. "Don't let them make it safe and easy and ordinary. Keep it hard. Keep it real. That's how we honor the ones who didn't make it home." He died 3 hours later. Kadir stayed until the end, holding his hand, watching the monitors flatline. The funeral was held at the Air Force Academy with full honors. The chapel was packed with pilots and generals and politicians who'd never met him but knew his reputation. They gave speeches about duty and sacrifice. A missing man formation flew overhead, one jet peeling away into the empty sky. Kadir stood at attention through all of it, her face a mask. But inside, she was back in the cockpit of Warthog 27, fighting the storm, hearing Kavak's voice over the radio. "Bring it home, Lieutenant. Just bring it home." She retired from the Air Force 2 years later at the rank of colonel. There was a ceremony, a few speeches, another medal she didn't need. Her students came from across the country to see her off, lined up in dress blues, saluting as she walked out of the building for the last time. She didn't look back. Looking back was for people who had regrets. Kadir had none. She'd done what she set out to do, survived, taught others to survive, left the Air Force better than she'd found it. But retirement didn't suit her. She tried teaching at a civilian flight school, found it boring. Tried consulting, found it soulless. Tried doing nothing, found it unbearable. She was 52 years old, too young to be finished, too old to start over. The limp was worse now, the leg aching in cold weather, reminding her of the day she'd been shot down. She walked with a cane sometimes, hated it, hated what it represented. She'd been Valkyrie once. Now she was just another veteran with a bad knee and too many memories. Then the call came from the Smithsonian. They were opening a new exhibit on women in military aviation and wanted to feature her story. Specifically, they wanted Warthog 27. The wreckage had been in storage for nearly 2 decades, forgotten in a warehouse in Ohio. They wanted to restore it, put it on display, make it a symbol of resilience and courage. They wanted her to be there for the unveiling, to tell the story in her own words. Kadir almost said no. The idea of standing in front of crowds, reliving the worst moment of her life for public consumption, felt exploitative. But then she thought about Kavak, about the students she'd trained, about the pilots who'd written her over the years, thanking her for teaching them to hold on. And she realized the story wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to all of them, to anyone who'd ever faced the impossible and refused to quit. The restoration took 2 years. The Smithsonian team worked with engineers and historians to rebuild the A-10 as close to its post-crash state as possible. They couldn't restore the missing wing. It had never been recovered, so they left the right side as a stump, the ragged metal preserved behind glass. They cleaned the fuselage, repaired the landing gear, mounted it on a platform that made it look like it was still in motion, and they kept the nose art. Valkyrie, sword raised, defiant. The exhibit opened on a cold morning in November. Kadir stood in front of the aircraft with a microphone in her hand and 1,000 people in the audience. Reporters, veterans, students, families. She prepared remarks, written and rewritten them a dozen times. But when the moment came, she set the notes aside and spoke from memory. "This aircraft should not exist," she said, gesturing to the A-10 behind her. "By every rule of physics and engineering, it should have fallen from the sky the moment that wing came off. But it didn't. It kept flying because I refused to let it quit. And I kept flying because it refused to let me quit. We held each other up. That's the lesson. That's what I want people to understand." She paused, her voice catching. "We're stronger than we think, all of us. When everything falls apart and the world says we're finished, we have a choice. We can accept it, or we can hold on. 1 second at a time, 1 decision at a time, until we're home." The audience was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone was clapping, standing, the applause echoing through the hall. Kadir stood there, overwhelmed, staring at the aircraft that had defined her life. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't sleek or modern or impressive. It was scarred and broken and held together by sheer stubbornness. But it was real, and it was hers. After the ceremony, people lined up to meet her. Veterans who'd flown A-10s, students who'd gone through the Valkyrie protocol, families of pilots who'd been saved by the training. They all wanted to shake her hand, take a photo, tell her what her story meant to them. Kadir obliged, patient and gracious, but inside she was exhausted. She'd never been comfortable with attention, preferred the cockpit to the spotlight, but she understood now that this was part of the mission. The last part, passing the torch. Among the crowd was a young woman in an Air Force uniform. First lieutenant, pilot wings on her chest. She approached nervously, introduced herself as Riley Chen, said she just graduated from the Valkyrie protocol. "You probably don't remember me," she said, "but you changed my life." Kadir smiled. "I remember. You had trouble with the single-engine scenarios, kept trying to climb when you should have been conserving energy." Riley laughed, surprised. "Yeah, you chewed me out for it." "Did it help?" "I'm still here, aren't I?" Riley hesitated, then added, "I deployed to Syria last year, took a hit during a gun run. Lost hydraulics, partial flight control. I thought about ejecting. But then I remembered what you said, one decision at a time. I brought it home." Kadir felt something break open in her chest, a warmth that spread through the exhaustion and doubt. This was why she'd done it, why she'd spent 20 years teaching instead of flying. "Good," she said quietly. "That's good." Riley saluted. Kadir returned it. They stood there for a moment, two pilots separated by a generation but connected by something deeper. Then Riley walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and Kadir was alone again. Alone with the aircraft and the memories and the knowledge that she'd done enough. More than enough. The exhibit became one of the most popular in the museum. Thousands of visitors every week, drawn by the impossible story and the physical proof of what determination could accomplish. Schools brought field trips. Veterans brought their families. Pilots on leave made pilgrimages, standing in front of Warthog 27 and imagining themselves in the cockpit, fighting the storm. The story evolved in the telling, grew larger, more mythic. But the core remained. A pilot and her aircraft, refusing to quit, bringing each other home. Kadir visited the exhibit once a year, always on the anniversary of the landing. She'd stand in front of the aircraft, alone after the museum closed, and talk to it. Thanked it for not giving up, apologized for breaking it, promised it would never be forgotten. It was a ritual, maybe a superstition, but it felt right. The A-10 had saved her life. The least she could do was remember. Years turned to decades. Kadir's hair went white. The cane became permanent. She moved slower, thought slower, but her mind stayed sharp. She wrote a memoir, though she hated the process, hated reliving every painful detail. But the publisher insisted it was important, that people needed to hear the full story. The book sold modestly, won a few awards, was adopted by the Air Force Academy as required reading. Kadir did a book tour, gave interviews, appeared on podcasts. She was polite but distant, never quite comfortable with the attention. She wasn't a hero, she insisted, just a pilot who'd done her job. But the world disagreed. The medals kept coming, the honors kept coming. A building at Nellie's was named after her, a scholarship fund for women in aviation, a statue at the Air Force Memorial. Each one felt like an anchor, weighing her down with expectations she'd never asked for. She attended the ceremonies because it was expected, smiled for the cameras, said the right things. But inside, she was still that lieutenant in the cockpit, fighting the storm, wondering if she'd live to see tomorrow. Then at age 78, Kadir received one final honor. The Air Force announced they were retiring the A-10 Thunderbolt II after 53 years of service. The final flight would be a ceremonial event, a farewell to the Warthog, and they wanted Kadir to be there. Not just as a guest. They wanted her to fly it. One last time. Kadir's first instinct was to refuse. She hadn't flown in over 20 years. Her reflexes were shot, her eyesight was failing, and her leg couldn't handle the strain. But the Air Force insisted. They'd get her medical clearance, put her through simulator training, pair her with an instructor pilot. It would be safe, controlled, symbolic. A chance to close the circle. To say goodbye to the aircraft that had defined her life. She agreed. The training was harder than she'd expected. Her body didn't respond the way it used to, couldn't handle the G-forces or the rapid inputs. But muscle memory was a powerful thing. Once she was in the cockpit, once her hands were on the stick and throttle, it all came back. The scan patterns, the calculations, the feel of the aircraft responding to her touch. The instructor pilot, a captain young enough to be her grandson, watched with quiet amazement as she ran through the procedures flawlessly. "You're a natural," he said. Kadir smiled. "I'm a survivor." The final flight was scheduled for a bright morning in May at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, the boneyard where old aircraft went to die. Hundreds of A-10s sat in rows on the desert floor, retired and awaiting their fate. Some would be scrapped, some would be preserved, all would be forgotten eventually. But not today. Today, one of them would fly. Kadir walked out to the aircraft, moving slowly, her cane clicking on the tarmac. The waiting for her was pristine, freshly painted, the nose art reading Valkyrie II. A crowd had gathered, pilots, maintainers, reporters, veterans. They applauded as she approached. She ignored them, focused on the aircraft. This wasn't for them. This was personal. The crew chief helped her into the cockpit. Everything was familiar, the layout, the smell of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel, the way the seat cradled her body. She ran through the pre-flight checklist, her hands moving automatically. The engine spooled up with a whine that turned into a roar. She taxied to the runway, lined up, advanced the throttle. The A-10 accelerated, faster, faster, then lifted into the sky. And Kadir was flying again. The sensation was overwhelming. The G-forces pressed her into the seat, the controls vibrated in her hands, the desert spread out below in shades of brown and gold. She climbed to 5,000 feet, leveled off, took a moment to just exist in the moment. This was what she'd been missing. Not the adrenaline or the danger or the glory, just this. The feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She flew a wide circle around the boneyard, dipped the wings in salute to the retired aircraft below, then turned back toward the runway. The landing was smooth, textbook perfect. The A-10 touched down gently, rolled to a stop. Kadir sat in the cockpit for a long moment, her hands still on the controls, reluctant to let go. But eventually she did. She shut down the engines, opened the canopy, climbed out. The crowd was cheering. She didn't hear them. She was staring at the sky, at the empty space where she'd just been, memorizing the blue. That night, alone in her hotel room, Kadir wrote a letter, not to anyone specific, just words on paper, a final accounting. She wrote about Wright-Patterson, about the wing coming off, about the terror and the determination and the impossible landing. She wrote about the pilots she'd trained, the lives she'd saved, the legacy she'd leave. She wrote about Kavak, about the students who'd become teachers, about the aircraft that had refused to die. And she wrote about the sky. How it had called to her from the moment she was old enough to look up. How it had given her purpose, identity, meaning. How it had taken everything and given back more. She sealed the letter, addressed it to the Smithsonian, asked them to display it with the exhibit. Then she went to bed and dreamed of flying. Kadir passed away peacefully 6 months later. Heart failure, the doctors said. Old age. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. Just a body that had finally run out of time. The funeral was held at Arlington with full military honors. The chapel overflowed. The cemetery was lined with pilots in dress blues, standing at attention, saluting as the flag-draped casket passed. 3 A-10s flew overhead in missing man formation, the slot where she should have been painfully empty. The sound of the GAU-8 cannon echoed one last time as a final salute, and then silence. The letter was added to the exhibit as requested. Visitors read her words, looked at the aircraft, tried to imagine what it had been like. Some understood, most didn't, but all of them left with the same thought, that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and doing it anyway, about holding on when letting go was easier, about refusing to accept the world's verdict on what was possible. Valkyrie had shown them that, and her story, like the aircraft she'd flown, would endure, not because it was comfortable or easy or safe, but because it was true. And the truth, like the sky, belonged to everyone.